Thank you. It's good to see everybody. My goodness, didn't you people have anything else to do today? Every known picture of Jeb Stewart up here on the screen, and of course the statue, which now resides in the Richmond Wastewater Treatment Plant facility. Down, Sue Ann, down. 32 years ago, I got this crazy idea that we ought to save the site of Jeb Stewart's birthplace, and mainly because I read things like this where he talked about it. So we're going to talk about him today. We're going to talk about his brothers, William Alexander Stewart and John Dabney Stuart, who of course lived here in Floyd, and a few other things. But it's mainly about Jeb Stewart, but it's also about his brothers in the war. So I call it Brothers in Arms, which is a great Dire Straits song, if you remember back when we were in college. Yeah, that was a great one. But this is Stephen Vincent Benet's John Brown Body. It's Stewart of Laurel Hill. And blatant book promotion over there on the other side, which are all back here on this table if any of you are interested. But I wanted to talk, I've been doing this talk for a while. Sue Ann and some of you, Dana, probably have seen this thing in various forms. Gene, maybe, for 20 or 30 years. So I tried to put new stuff in it. So we're going to try to put some new stuff in it today and talk about the Stewart boys. Here are two new books I'm working on. One is A Portrait of Jeb Stewart, which is about all the controversies we've had over the last few years about the Martin Clark taking the portrait down in the courthouse and the change of the name of the Fairfax High School and Monument Avenue. And everybody asks me what I think about it. Well, you're going to have to buy a book to find out. But it's 500 pages. It's the gift that just keeps on giving because they won't ever decide what they're going to do with some of this stuff. I just keep writing about it. And I've been working on Jeb Stewart's papers for years. I'm working on volume 2 right now, and that's right. That's him in the United States 1st Cavalry uniform. That's the only picture I've ever seen of him in the United States Army. So I'm working on that right now. Really, I just sell Andy Griffith books, and I don't care anymore, but you know. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't comment on my good friend Gerald Vie. 22 years ago, I was in the Superdome in New Orleans. Michael Vick had just led the Hokies back from behind to take the lead at the beginning of the 4th quarter. I will admit to you, by this time I had had several adult beverages. So I went to the bathroom between the quarters. Now I'm in the New Orleans Superdome, which probably holds 70,000 people maybe, something like that. And there's only so much a man can take. So I go to the restroom and I look 2 urinals down and there is Gerald Vie. How in the world we both decided to go to the bathroom at the very same time, I will never know. But he looks up, he sees me, and he goes, and I think Gerald had had several adult beverages by this time. Tom Perry, how the hell are you? We did not shake hands. That's a true story. I really did run into him in the back. I knew he was there, but I didn't know where he was. And I put on this slide the pictures of the Jubal Early home place in the bottom left and the bottom right. And if you go out there today, you will be absolutely amazed at the difference. And if you want to see a memorial to our friend Gerald, right there it is, because it's amazing how far that place has come. Last fall, I went up to the picnic that the what's the SCV camp? Roanoke. Fincastle Rifles had. Red Barber, who bless his heart has passed away too since then. Red, I get there, and I'm just there for the hot dogs. And Red goes, "Would you like to say something about Gerald?" Of course, what happened was Red didn't want to get up and say anything about Gerald because he knew he'd lose it. And so I got up, and yes, that's right. I lost it. Only time I can ever remember breaking down in the middle of a speech, unless there was a lot of money involved, So. But My last Gerald Vi story is about that marker on the bottom left there. When I was a little boy, this is what got me interested in history. My mother said that it just drove her insane the way I would ask her questions about Stuart's birthplace. And in 2000, we replaced that marker. It has 3 bullet holes in it. You can't really see it. And I tried to get the Virginia Department of Historic Resources to give it to the birthplace, but they wouldn't do it, and so I figured it was destroyed. Well, I guess about 10 years ago, I get a phone call from Gerald Vi. And Gerald says, "Tom Perry, I got something you might want." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "Come up to my brother's garage and I'll show you." So I go up to Gerald's brother's garage, and lo and behold, what does Gerald have? The historic marker he had somehow swindled out of the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. So it'd take like 4 grown men to load this thing. It weighed like 300 pounds. It was unbelievable how heavy it was. And today, if you go to the Jeb Stewart Birthplace, was it you, Jim, was talking about went down there? This is now at the Jeb Stewart Birthplace with an interpretive sign. There's 2 of them now. There's the 1932 one, which you see here, and the 2000 one, which is out at the road. I believe this one was written by Douglas Southall Freeman and put up about the time of Jeb Stewart's, it would have been his 100th birthday. So everybody needs a friend like Gerald Vi, and I'll leave you at that. In 1870, William Alexander Stewart, shown here on your right, is on a train. He looks up, and who does he see also on this same train but Robert Edward Lee? It's 1870. Robert E. Lee has been to Washington to visit Ulysses S. Grant in the White House. William Alexander Stewart approaches General Lee. This is in his diary, which I think is at the Saltville at the Museum of Middle Appalachia. He approaches General Lee, and General Lee, probably thinking he's seeing a ghost, says, "Do I know you, sir?" And William reportedly says to him, "No, sir, but I believe you knew my brother." And wouldn't you love to have heard that conversation? William Alexander Stewart and Robert E. Lee talking about Jeb Stewart 6 years after the war has ended. One of the stories that William Alexander Stewart, who is Jeb Stewart's older brother, as is John Dabney Stuart, was this one, which was painted by our friend Pat Woltz in Mount Airy, of Jeb Stewart about age 9, discovering hornets at Laurel Hill, his birthplace. And instead of retreating, as William Alexander Stewart is shown to be doing here, Jeb attacks, suffers his first battle wounds. But William always said he knew that his little brother was a fighter because he would not let those hornets win. And this is a artist depiction. We don't really know what Stewart's birthplace looked like exactly. This is Cobbler Springs, which is the home of Judge Brown in Wytheville, and we'll get to that in a minute. I would point out to you, though, that wonderful little red dog there in that painting, if you're looking at it. I love telling this story. Pat Woltz painted 2 of these. One, the birthplace still sells. You can buy one that has a little black and white dog. And this one. And this one is my red chow, who was named, that's right, Jeb Stewart. Jeb Stewart was very much a one-person dog, as chows are, and I was the one person. One day, Jeb Stewart IV is coming to Ararat to visit his great-grandfather's birthplace. He hasn't been since he's a little boy, and my father and I are waiting at my father's house for Colonel Stewart to come. Well, as if you knew my father probably was wanting to talk about some baseball game or some such thing, and we're not paying attention. All of a sudden, outside, we hear Jeb Stewart, the dog, crank up. And my father and I looked at each other, and we're like, oh, God. And we run out the door, and what do we find? Jeb Stewart IV on his knee, rubbing the belly of Jeb the dog. Colonel Stewart looks up at me, He's a retired full bird colonel now in the United States Army. He looks up at me and says, "This is a beautiful animal, Tom. What's his name?" This is also, of course, the birthplace of John Dabney Stuart and William Alexander Stuart. They owned about 1,500 acres in Patrick County, and all three of these boys grow up on this farm, which of the 1,500 acres, 75 acres are preserved today. This is Cobbler Springs today. It was the home of Judge James Ewell Brown, who Jeb Stewart is named after. Judge Brown was married to Archibald Stuart's sister, so by the time Jeb came along, they're grasping for names, so it's James Ewell Brown Stewart. And that house, as far as I know, is still there. It's out near an industrial park on the Peppers Ferry Road, I guess, in Wytheville. Jeb, about age 12, they send him up to Wytheville to go to school. They also do this same kind of thing, I think, with John Dabney and with William Alexander Stuart. Because of Judge Brown being there, they have somebody in the family prominent, and they go to school. Because, Patrick County doesn't have a school system. There aren't any schools yet. And Jeb spends about 3 years in and around Wytheville and Pulaski going to school. We also, I think maybe, he comes up here to Floyd, although I've never been able to prove this. He ends up, I guess it was with Gonaway, who taught school up here, who also ends up at Duke, or what becomes Duke. It's Trinity College, but will become Duke University. So John may have actually come to school here. Jeb also goes up to Pulaski to the Reverend Painter's boys' school. So he's in and around for about 3 years before. I love telling this story. One of the guys that he encounters in Wytheville is this man, David French Boyd. David French Boyd and Stewart will go to school. Boyd will end up being a colonel in the Confederate Army. He actually will be in the Western Theater. He becomes good friends with, of all people, William Sherman. And Boyd is captured during the war, and Sherman takes special care to make sure that his friend is taken care of. After the war, David French Boyd is going to end up at a place called LSU. The reason is that he and Sherman, before the war, actually taught at the boys' school that became LSU. William Sherman at LSU. I bet you never thought about that on football Saturday. But Sherman leaves LSU to go north and join the United States Army. Boyd will join the Confederate Army. If you go to LSU today and to Auburn, David French Boyd has a building named, at least he used to, has a building named for him at both places. And he writes an interesting memoir about Jeb Stewart, growing up with Jeb Stewart after the war, and sent it to Jeb's widow. And it's at LSU, the original. And she writes things in the margins and sends it back to him. One of the things that just blew my mind, she says that General Stewart in Kansas will actually pass the bar exam and become a lawyer. I've never seen that anywhere else, except in the margins of David French Boyd. The reason he left Wytheville supposedly was this girl broke his heart. And we'll get back to her in just a minute. Jeb goes down to Emory and Henry College, the Fighting Eddie Wheelers, where he will, I like to say, find God, generals, and girls. He joins the Methodist Church while he's there. He is one of, I think, 6 Confederate generals that ended up going to the small little school. Eddie Wheeler, who we all know up in Roanoke, can name you every one of them. I cannot, except Grumble Jones and James B. Gordon are 2 of the other ones. And Jeb finds, of course, imagine that, girls. He supposedly came back in 1859 to Emory and Henry to give a speech. By this time, he is a lieutenant in the United States Army. He is getting ready to put down John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry, among other things. And he comes to give a speech at his alma mater. It's always fun to go back to your alma mater and give a speech, especially when they're not asking you for money. Jeb gets up there and starts talking, and he forgets where he is. And Stewart falls face first off the front of the stage and lands at the foot of his beloved, the lady he's interested in. Or he tells this story about him falling face first, lands at Sue Ann's feet right here, and looks up, and the person laughing the hardest is, of course, her. And he tells this on himself, which is interesting that he would do that. I think they sent him to Emory and Henry for 2 years. They were grooming him. He is the youngest son. He's not going to inherit really anything. So he has a choice. He can, I guess, be a minister, a teacher, or a soldier. And he becomes a soldier. This is Jeb Stewart on the left, about the time he enters West Point, about 17 years old, having what I can only describe as a really bad hair day. William Alexander Stewart is over here on the right, and he, by this time, has been a clerk of court. I think Judge Brown got him a job in Wytheville, and he's in the clerk of court. He starts a business in Wytheville, and he's coming up. I used to go to Patrick County High School and do a talk on the war to the 11th graders, and it never failed that every time I would show this slide, all the, shall we say, teenage females in the room would look at William and kind of gasp aloud. Apparently, he would be the prom date, not little brother Jeb, was the thing that I took from that. But if you ever have met Jeb Stewart V, who's a doctor in Richmond, William Alexander Stewart looks just like him. It's amazing, the resemblance between the two of them. But here they are, both in their youth, getting ready to begin their lives. Jeb spends 4 years at West Point. One of the guys he encounters, I like to tell you about his friends and people that he met that you probably never heard of. This is Jonathan Hamby Carter, who grew up near Mount Airy, North Carolina, which you wonder how he and Jeb Stewart knew each other. Well, from his house to Jeb Stewart's house in Virginia is only 10 miles. And the Carters are a very old and prominent family in Patrick County, Carter's Mountain, you know, over there where Route 8 hits 103. And he goes and visits Jeb Stewart. One of the things that I find interesting about him is he's going to join the Confederate Navy after a long career in the United States Navy. He actually graduates from Annapolis. He will go all the way to Japan, I think, with Perry, no relation. And after that, he joins the Confederate, and he ends up building boats on the Red River during the war and lives to tell about all this. And his letters are in a book called A Man and His Boat, if any of you are interested in it. Jeb Stewart, I think closer to the time he graduates in this photo, look at those eyes. He's about 5'10", 5'11", red hair, piercing blue eyes, and by this time he's got his hair under control, you'll notice. He spends, of course, 4 years at West Point at the United States Military Academy. 2 of those years, Robert E. Lee is the superintendent. So this is the first time that he and Robert E. Lee will encounter each other. Robert E. Lee and Jeb Stewart's father knew each other. Jeb's father had done some legal work for Lee and his brothers. Jeb Stewart will graduate 1854, 13th in a class of 46, I think, something like that. The family tradition is that he didn't want to be an engineer, and that his senior year he kind of let his grades drop down. He had been as high as 6th or 7th in his class. First in his class was Robert E. Lee's son Custis. Second was Oliver Otis Howard, the famous Union general, or as we like to call him, uh-oh, because every time Stonewall Jackson seemed to come calling, uh-oh was what he probably said. Stewart is going to go out west. He's going to be in Texas for a little while, and then he'll join the 1st United States Cavalry, mainly in Kansas Territory. And here's our buddy Oliver Otis Howard. Stewart and Howard became good friends at West Point. These two are about as opposite of human beings as one could imagine if you know anything about Howard. Stewart, the outgoing Southerner, Howard, the abolitionist, introvert kind of. But what Howard wrote about Stewart was that they did Bible study together. Most of the Southerners at West Point wouldn't even talk to Oliver Otis Howard. because of his abolitionist viewpoint. Stewart didn't care. Stewart and he did Bible study. And Howard writes about it in his autobiographical book that he'll publish after the war. Stewart was a very religious man. This probably blows it for about half of you, because you think of him probably as the life of the party. But he had joined the Methodist Church. He will eventually join the Episcopal Church of his mother. In Kansas, he helped build a church that's at Junction City, Kansas, near Fort Riley. It's still there. You walk in the front door, and there's a big plaque there that says this church founded by Lieutenant J.E.B. Stewart. He sent his mother some money and asked her to match it to build a comfortable log church near his birthplace. And this doesn't necessarily go over too well at the Ararat Rooting Club, because he said he'd never seen a place that needed one so bad. There are churches now in Ararat who claim they're that church, by the way. They fight over it now. None of them are, but they want to be. They want to be. And this, of course, like I said, is the only photo of Jeb Stewart in his United States Army uniform. And again, he's grown that beard that will become famous by this time, and he's still got them piercing blue eyes. While in Kansas, he will meet and marry Flora Cook, the daughter of Philip St. George Cook, who is not his commanding officer, but a very prominent soldier in the United States Army. He wrote the cavalry manual, for instance. They will have, actually I think they have more like 4 children, but only these are photographed. The child on the bottom is Flora, who is named for her mother. The little boy is originally Philip St. George Cook Stewart, named after his grandfather. And the little girl in the middle is Virginia Pelham Stewart, who was born during the war and is named for the state and for young John Pelham, one of Stewart's favorite artillerymen under his command. Jeb's beard's getting a little thicker. The hair's looking good. He's a married man now out in Kansas for 7 years, where he encounters, among other people, this fellow. John Brown and Jeb Stewart first meet in 1856 at the Battle of Blackjack, where Brown is, shall we say, not doing really nice things with his broadsword, is how I will put that. Stewart, of course, will encounter him again in 1859 when Brown tries to take the arsenal at Harper's Ferry. Stewart happens to be in Washington trying to sell his saber hitching device to the War Department. He got $5,000 for that thing, which is a lot of money in 1859. Stewart will go with Robert E. Lee in the Marines and put down John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Of course, Stewart, I think, is the only one who recognizes who John Brown is, because he's seen him before. Brown is going by the name of Smith, I think, during Harper's Ferry, but Stewart immediately recognizes him. And if you want to see why the Civil War started, all you have to do is go and read the conversations after this between Jeb Stewart and John Brown that the reporters apparently recorded. Stewart visited him in the jail, and it's very easy to see why we had a Civil War, because of the way the two of them are going at each other. Brown basically tells him, I could have killed you at any moment. I wanted to, and all this sort of thing. And Stewart, is accusing Brown of treason, and it's not pretty. It is not a pretty conversation. He will resign on May the 3rd, 1861, and offer his sword to Virginia. He will be in the 1st Virginia Cavalry, the Battle of First Manassas. He'll get promoted. He will command the cavalry under Robert E. Lee. He does his first ride around McClellan. He becomes a major general. Antietam, 2 more times he rides around McClellan. And by Fredericksburg, he is major general, commanding all of Robert E. Lee's cavalry division. He had some very interesting young men who served under him. This, of course, on the left is John Mosby, the Gray Ghost, who was one of the more famous guerrilla fighters. He had been a scout for Stewart early in the war. And John Pelham on the right, who had been the famous artilleryman who lost his life in the early part of 1863, and Stewart named his daughter after him. One that I just love telling is, this is Frank Stringfellow. I don't know if any of you remember this. PBS had this show called Mercy Street on a few years back, and it was about Frank Stringfellow. He was a spy, basically, under Stuart, and the whole show is about him running around in Alexandria and places trying not to get caught by the Yankees. He ends up being a minister after the war in Martinsville. And I think I know why he was driven into the hands of God. During his time in Alexandria, the Yankees recognized him and took off after old Frank. Frank took off running, and he ended up in the house of this woman who had invited him in when she saw this coming. And the Yankees come in the house. They don't see Frank Stringfellow. They go out the back door. Frank is hidden under the lady's hoop skirt. And I think this is the reason he found God. But that's a real story, and that's what he really looked like. He comes to Martinsville, as I said, and ends up being an Episcopal minister there. He's what do you call it? A rainmaker. Wherever he goes, he raises money and builds churches. That's what Frank did. Again, one of Jeb Stewart's younger men. Stuart, as a soldier, has the best of times and the worst of times, I like to say. He, at Chancellorsville, will take over for Stonewall Jackson when Jackson is wounded. Stuart will fight the largest cavalry battle in the Western Hemisphere up to that time at Brandy Station a month later. And of course, Gettysburg comes a month after that, so that whole forest could be cut down for people to write books about Jeb Stewart and Gettysburg. And here we go. The famous encounter, which I'm sure you've all seen in Gettysburg, where Joseph Fuqua shows up at Martin Sheen's house to be dressed down by General Lee. It never happened. There's not one bit of evidence from somebody who's actually there that this ever happened, that Robert E. Lee dressed Jeb Stewart down. It's one of those things that the more you tell it, the more it becomes the truth. It comes from a story written about 20 years after the war, that's at the University of North Carolina, which makes it doubtful to begin with. Go Hokies. I will say this, though, Duke and Carolina do have great libraries. I'm not sure about their cheating basketball programs, but they do have great libraries. But this never really happened. Now, you've read about this. Everybody writes about this. Now, what Robert E. Lee would do if you did something that he was not pleased with, he didn't dress you down in front of everybody. He took you into his office, and quietly, you had a talk about it. And Stewart never wrote about it. Robert E. Lee never wrote about it. And Robert E. Lee probably said, General Stewart, you're here. Help me beat these people. And that's what he did to A.P. Hill. That's what he, I think, does to Jeb Stewart. But still, we can have Martin Sheen and Joseph Fuqua, in a movie, and that's all fun. But that's not necessarily what really happened. Well, here we go. John Dabney Stuart, while all this is going on, born about 5 years before Jeb Stewart at Laurel Hill. Of course, this is a very bad picture I stole from John Stewart's book of Glenada, the house that's just right around the corner from us here. John Dabney Stuart is, again, kind of in the same situation. He's not going to really inherit anything. He needs a profession. What does he do? He comes to Floyd and starts studying medicine under his brother-in-law, Tazewell Hedden or Hayden. How do you pronounce that? Hedden. Yeah, well, I've seen it both ways, and I've actually had people almost fight me over how to pronounce Hayden's last name. Hedden is married to John's sister Mary, and John Stewart is going to spend quite a bit of time here studying medicine. John also, I think, went to Hampton-Sydney to school. I think he may have even gone as far as Philadelphia to medical school. So he had quite a bit of an education. This is a photo of him that comes from the Stewart family, which I believe is him. Sometimes you got to be careful of these things because, what you do is you have to look at the hairstyle and what they're wearing to figure out if it really is him. His medical career didn't get off to too good a start. I think the very first patient he ever had was a guy named Nathaniel Henry, who was the son of Patrick Henry. And apparently John had thumped on his chest a little bit, was examining him, and Nathaniel decided to die at that exact moment, which wasn't a very good beginning for John Dabney's medical career. I think this happened about 1851 or so. John, like I said, is going to spend a lot of time here in Floyd before the war especially. And he, like Jeb and William, both born at Laurel Hill in beautiful downtown Ararat. I was trying to think if there's anything else about him. Here's Dr. Hedden and Mary, who lived here in Floyd also. This is from John Stewart's book, which I'll talk about a little bit more, which is just a masterpiece of Stewart family history, I think. He spent years working on this, and I'll talk about him in a minute. But I don't know if you've ever seen this. This is, Tazewell and Mary, about the time they would have lived here in Floyd. Of course, Hedden doesn't have a very good ending. He will actually serve, I think, in the Virginia House of Delegates with Archibald Stuart, Jeb and John's father. He had medical students, like I already mentioned. About 1855, though, he is, quote, committed for lunacy to the Stanton, which I guess is kind of like the Woodrow Wilson is today. He maybe was, intemperance was the word they used. And I don't know if that means he had an alcohol problem or if he had a morphine problem or what, but he will be committed. And Mary will lose the house, I believe, here in Floyd eventually. And she will end up kind of destitute. And she will live with her brother, William Alexander Stewart, in Saltville for pretty much the rest of her life. She's buried in Saltville, right beside William Alexander Stewart and his family. But there they are. One thing that's kind of an apocryphal story that I love to tell, any of you over who knew, what was it? It would be John Perry Alderman and his father. His father is just, I forget, over in Carroll County. John, the older, used to tell me this story that there was a fella in Carroll County named Archibald Stuart Marshall, and that he looked just like Jeb Stewart. And the older alderman, who is John Alderman, and then John Perry Alderman, his son. John Alderman told me he saw this guy around a store, and he looked just like Jeb Stewart. Well, the story within the families is that Archibald, shown here, who served in the same position as Geno Williams, I believe, at one time. I'm not making any parallels to what I'm about to say. Archibald, ladies and gentlemen, was the life of the party. And by that I mean, if you go looking through order books in Southwest Virginia, you will find Jeb Stewart's father, Archibald here, arrested for being in a gambling den when it's busted by the police. He has horrible debt problems. He ends up, they come to Ararat because his wife's land is all he's got left. So he ends up coming to Ararat to live there. He has a terrible problem managing money, and he liked to apparently have a good time. There's all kinds of rumors of multiple families that Archibald Stuart had. Apparently, he was equal opportunity. It didn't matter what color they were, black or white. There's all kinds of stories about this man, none of them really proven, but he sure is interesting to talk about. The really thing that I'm talking about here is Archibald Stuart Marshall was apparently his son also. And he served in the 54th Virginia and was apparently wounded during the war. And the doctor who took care of him was his half-brother, John Dabney Stuart. Now, I'm not trying to besmirch Archibald Stuart's good name. I'm just telling you what I have found over the years. I would point out that the reaction between fathers and sons is very interesting. You don't see this activity in really any of his sons, Jeb, William, or John. There's none of that going on with them. In fact, Jeb Stewart was a temperance man. Jeb didn't drink. Archibald, though, apparently took care of that problem for the family. Mrs. Stewart, Archibald has the most interesting will you're ever going to read. He basically says in his will that Mrs. Stewart inherits all of this as long as she doesn't mess with any, quote, arrangements that he has with others. which is, I think, code for leave the other families alone and you can have everything, at the Laurel Hill. But the story is that now, just to show you how things get messed up, the story for years was that Jeb Stewart was who took care of Archibald Stuart Marshall. Well, that couldn't happen because Archibald Stuart Marshall's in the 54th Virginia. He's out west. Jeb Stewart is in the Army of Northern Virginia. So I think it was John who takes care of his half-brother. And Archibald, as you can see there, lives till 1914 so that John Alderman could get to know him. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. As the war progresses, Jeb Stewart, shown here in the only standing photo I've ever seen of him, wearing a mourning band on his arm. He had lost his daughter Flora. He had lost his chief of staff, Channing Price. He had lost John Pelham. It's a war, people. This isn't Moonlight and Magnolias. This is a serious war, and you lose people. Stewart, of course, is going to fight George Custer's men on May the 11th, 1864 at Yellow Tavern just north of Richmond, where he will be mortally wounded, shot in the stomach by one of Custer's men. The thing I'd point out about this picture is he looks much thinner than I've always thought he was in some of the other pictures, but he's standing up. They take him to his brother-in-law's house in Richmond. It's very close to where the Jefferson Hotel is today. It's actually where the Richmond Police Station and parking lot are today. He will pass away at 7:30, May 12th, which was just a few days ago. His last words reportedly were, "God's will be done." The Richmond City Council comes calling 2 days later to Mrs. Stewart and asks her to leave him in Richmond and that one day they want to, quote, put up a statue to honor him. Apparently they didn't keep their word forever on this thing. Robert E. Lee finds out about Jeb Stewart dying, and he breaks down, much as he did, I think, for Stonewall Jackson a year earlier. I can scarcely think of him without weeping. William Alexander Stewart, shown here on the right, pretty much makes it his life's mission to take care of his family. He will have Jeb Stewart's widow Flora and her children come to Saltville, where he is now running the salt works. He takes care of her. He takes care of his sister Mary. He takes care of his mother Elizabeth, who moves from Danville and comes to Saltville. Pretty soon, William Alexander Stewart will have almost his entire remaining family with him there. And of course, he will go on to found Stewart Cattle Company and will become a fabulously wealthy man. I think he will lose it and make it back. His son is Henry Carter Stewart, who becomes governor of Virginia. But just to show you what he would do, he had promised Jeb Stewart that Jeb didn't have anything to worry about. He should concentrate on the war and what he's doing, and that William will take care of the family. Jeb Stewart, I mentioned that $5,000 he had got for the saber hitching device. He had put it in a bank in St. Louis. William went to St. Louis and got it and gave it to Flora. He was serious, and he took care of his brother's family. She, of course, will become a teacher and will end up in Stanton at what's now Stewart Hall. But William Stewart is buried in Saltville there on the right, and Jeb's buried in Hollywood Cemetery on the left. Remember I told you David French Boyd got his heart broke? Well, her name was Ellen Spiller. Ellen Spiller went on to marry Judge Brown's son, and he will pass away. And Jeb's brother William, first wife Mary, will pass away. And William Alexander Stewart ends up married to Ellen Spiller Brown Stewart. This is her grave. One thing I'll tell you, if you ever go to Saltville, is check this situation out right here. Jeb's parents are buried there. His sister Mary's buried there. William and Ellen are buried there. And Mary, the first wife, is buried there. But Mary's tombstone faces the opposite direction. Not that Ellen had anything to do with that. I don't know that she did, but I would point out that William and his two wives are buried right beside each other looking at his parents in Saltville. Jeb Stewart, of course, is there in Hollywood Cemetery. He was buried in two separate places. He's buried right beside the Pulitzer Prize-winning author Ellen Glasgow, buried right beside him. And, whoops, turned it wrong, sorry. This is another picture of John Dabney Stuart, but I don't think it's him. I think this is his son, who is John Dabney Stuart Jr. I don't know that for 100% sure, but I think that's what's going on. I'm sorry, I should have proofread my PowerPoint better. This is John's grave in Wytheville. It's been vandalized over the years. You can see that by looking at it, but it's there. He ended up living out where we call a rural retreat near Mount Airy, Virginia. His house is still there. In the last few years, it's been redone. It looks really, really good. But I always think about Rural Retreat as the birthplace of Dr. Pepper. I don't know why I think that, but I always do. But John is buried there in Wytheville. He will spend the rest of his life as a doctor and become a pretty prosperous farmer from everything I gather. The Stewart family has been fruitful and Roman numeraled. This is Jeb Stewart Jr. in the top left. You will remember him as Philip St. George Cook Stewart. When Jeb's father-in-law, a Virginian, did not join the Confederacy, Jeb changed his son's name. He became Jeb Stewart Jr. And that's him in the top left. He will be in the Spanish-American War, where I think he becomes friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Jeb III is the next. He became an engineer and worked for Con Edison and lived on Long Island, of all places. Jeb IV is next. He was full-bird colonel in the U.S. Army. And then Jeb V there, you'll notice the resemblance I was telling you about to William. That's Jeb V. He was a lieutenant colonel, U.S. Army. He's now an orthopedic surgeon in Richmond. Jeb V led the effort to try to get the city of Richmond to give the birthplace the statue of Jeb Stewart, which is probably not going to happen because they've given it to the Valentine Museum. And the bottom here are some of the descendants of William Alexander Stewart. The redhead is named Stewart, believe it or not. And this is William Letcher's grave, Jeb Stewart's great-grandfather, which is at the birthplace, if you've ever been or go. He was killed in the American Revolution. So this is like their sixth great-grandfather. They're standing at his grave. And here's John Stewart, who I've been bragging about. This was 2 weeks ago in Maine. He and I had the best lobster I ever had in my life. But he was written a book about his great-grandfather. He's a retired English professor. And I have a couple copies of this book if you're interested in them. It's just full of stuff I've never seen before, even I never found research, and John has found. And like I said, he's William Alexander Stewart's great-grandson. You may not realize this, but all those men across the top served under Jeb Stewart, and almost every one of them ended up at Virginia Tech. Some of them were presidents, some of them were teachers. W.W. Blackford, who wrote War Years with Jeb Stewart, actually ended up laying out the grounds. Oh, sorry, that's a UVA word. The campus at Virginia Tech. This is Jeb Stewart VI. Over here on the left at the bottom, he is a Virginia Tech graduate in forestry. I don't know what happened to him. He's now in law school at the University of Richmond. But the fact that he went to Virginia Tech must have just wrangled his UVA-loving grandfather to no end. And of course, and there he is on the right, a rather tall James I. Robertson Jr., who was standing in a chair because he always wanted to be taller than me. And I won't tell you what he said the rest of that, but Bud helped me enormously over the years raise money for everything from Stewart's Birthplace to the Bassett Historical Center. And he absolutely greatest teacher I ever had. To sit in his Civil War class was just mesmerizing. And I'm sure a lot of people feel that way about Bud. But anyway, there's my hokey plug for the day. So anyway, we'll talk about the birthplace. Here's another one of those quotes that Jeb Stewart gave. if he survived, he wanted to come back to Patrick County. Let's say he survives the war. He's going to be in his 30s. He's going to be connected. I could easily see Jeb Stewart being the governor of Virginia or the senator from Virginia. He always had been a lawyer. I think he would have been successful beyond belief after the war, as his brothers were too. But he didn't get to do that. And so it's one of the reasons that we've tried to save a little part of his life down there in Patrick County. The birthplace today, there's that new marker over there on the right with my mother's blazing forsythia. And the house site there and the kitchen site. The birthplace is open dawn to dusk. They have a reenactment every October. But you can go out there anytime and walk around. There are trails, lots of interpretive signs. There's the view from the house of the Blue Ridge. If any of you are on the Parkway and you pull off at Pilot View near the Doe Run Lodge, that's what you're looking at right there. You'll be looking right down towards Stewart's birthplace. Like I said, there's trails, waterfalls. I like to say this, we have the world's dumbest beavers in Ararat, Virginia. You'll notice that the log is not in the river, it's on the land. But this is just some of the natural beauty. And when we started doing this those 30 years ago, I didn't do it because of, necessarily Jeb Stewart and the Confederacy. I did it because this was the most famous person in our community who had ever come from our community. So I wanted to explore all those histories. So there's things for everything from the Native Americans that we found there due to archaeology. There's stuff about the slaves who lived there, and there's lots about the Stewart family who lived there. And like I said, I think this top left here is George Kegley and some of the group from Roanoke. I'm sure you all remember old George. And me talking to the kids. The Ararat Roosting Club put up this beautiful piece of Mount Airy granite to recognize that it's Stewart's birthplace. We're on the Civil War trails, Civil War Discovery Trail, and it's, like I said, you can go out there any day, dawn to dusk. This is a very young Tom Perry. Gosh, look at him. Dang. And this is my mother and father with the new sign. Mother and father both passed away last year. So my mother is really the reason we're probably standing here today, because she encouraged this craziness all those years ago. My father was a retired school principal there in Patrick County. He had the greatest pickup line I ever heard any man have. His name was Erie, E-R-I-E, like the lake. And he told the ladies he was irresistible. And I thank you very much for having me here today.